Welcome to Emerging Franchise Brands, the podcast that introduces you to the visionary founders of America's fastest growing franchise opportunities. We'll also hear from industry pros as they share insights on what it really takes to achieve the elusive milestone of 100 plus locations. I am your host, Frank Fiume, founder of I9 Sports, and my 20-year journey from inception to acquisition has given me a unique perspective on how to succeed in franchising. Join me as we welcome today's guest. Before I start today's show, I have exciting news for founders, CEOs, and franchise brand presidents. Join me January 14th through the 16th, 2025 in Tampa for the first ever Emerging Franchise Brands live event, an exclusive opportunity designed just for you. It's my blueprint for success at every stage of franchising, one I wish I'd had, packed with real-world solutions and strategies to solve your challenges today and prepare for those you'll face tomorrow. Space is limited, so head over to emergingfranchisebrands.com to secure your spot today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. On today's episode, welcome to the 100th episode of our podcast. You don't know me. I am Anthony. I am the producer of the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast, and we decided to do something a little bit different for the 100th episode. Over the last 100 episodes, you've heard stories of franchise owners and franchise experts, and Frank has kind of sprinkled on his story here and there with a couple anecdotes, but today we're going to actually interview the man himself. Frank Fiume, welcome to the show, man.
Anthony, thank you for having me on the show. This is awesome.
Thank you for allowing me to host. You know, this is I've been sitting behind the camera there for the last 100 episodes, and it's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. I've learned so much from you and your guest, and it's time we turn the tables a little bit and learn a little bit more about you and your journey.
This has been an incredible ride. I'm just glad that you're finally out from behind the camera.
Yes.
And people could finally see you. You're the one that makes all the magic happen for all these episodes.
That's me. I'm the magician. So.
You are the magician.
All right, man. So let's just jump right into it. So again, we've kind of heard a little bit of your story over the last 100 episodes, but let's start right from the beginning. How did entrepreneurship find you? I know you've told the story of, you were doing medical sales. Mm-hmm. Kind of take us from there, and how did that kind of evolve?
So yeah, I was living in Long Island. I'm born and raised in New York, and I was in medical sales. Not happy in my career. That's where I was when I graduated college, and I used to play softball with college buddies, and on the weekends, and the leagues would run horribly, and I thought, maybe I could run a league as like a side business for the fun of it. And the more I started digging into this is in around 1994, the more I started digging into it, I realized that this was like a legitimate business that wasn't really being operated like a business by guys who had been running these leagues for 20, 30 years. They were making really, really good money, but they really weren't treating it with the professionalism that I thought was needed. So I started an adult men's softball league in New York. Within 5 years, we were the largest privately owned adult men's softball league in the state of New York. We had 1,000 teams, and I'm kind of overlapping here, but at the same time, that's how entrepreneurship found me. But at the same time, my wife and I had moved to the Tampa Bay area in 1996. And within a few years, I learned that the NFL was going to offer flag football as a way of promoting the game of football to kids. They really wanted to promote the NFL, and they were going to start these NFL flag leagues. I knew nothing about running kids sports. I knew exactly how to run a league since I'd been running the adult men's softball league. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to run a kids flag football league. My wife was totally supportive of it. And so before you knew it, we had adult men playing softball. We had kids playing flag football in the Tampa area, and kind of took off from there. At that point, I realized we were onto something. We need to figure out how we're going to expand. Are we going to open company-owned locations? Am I going to start hiring people, which was scary to me as anything, I think I was like a 28, 29-year-old at the time. Or are we going to franchise? And I knew nothing about franchising.
Now, did entrepreneurship kind of come from your background? Were your parents entrepreneurs? Like, how did that? What brought that on?
No. I was not really encouraged to get involved in starting my own business. I mean, I only heard stories of family members or friends that had started and failed in business. Though when I told my mom I wanted to start a softball league, of course, she was totally supportive of it. She thought it was a great idea, but I think I've jokingly have said in the past that if I told my mom I was going to rob a bank, she would say, "Well, honey, I know you're going to be the best at it," and she was very
supportive.
Yeah, she would have been very supportive. My dad was on the opposite end of the spectrum in that he was very conservative. He had a very successful career working in the medical field, but on the clinical side, and so he saw it as risk. He saw it as unnecessary risk because I had a really solid medical sales career, but it wasn't my dream. And I think maybe that's the problem when we venture off into entrepreneurship, that we have to make sure that we're doing something that we're living our dream and not living the dream through somebody else's eyes. And so my dad and I we didn't see eye to eye back then in my early 20s, and he didn't really understand what my vision was. And that's okay. I always say that our parents, our family, our friends, they love us. They want to see us to succeed. And when they tell us all the reasons why they think something is going to fail, it's because they don't see it for themselves. And that was the lesson I learned back then. I didn't realize it at the time, but as a 55-year-old now, I know why.
Looking back, yeah.
Yes.
When you're in it, your family, like you've said before, they have your best interest at heart.
Yeah.
They don't want to see you fail. And because they can't see it in themselves, they kind of project the fear onto you. And that kind of happened to me, entrepreneur to entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I've kind of went through that journey as well. It's funny because not to make this about me, but, I was in medical as well. I worked in a medical laboratory, and I had the career, I had the good paying job. And when I quit to do this, I did get a lot of pushback. Was that your experience as well?
Of course. And it's normal. And then what happens after your business takes off? We're often told, "I knew you were going to be successful. I knew it was going to work out." I'm like, that's not exactly the story that I remember, but that's okay.
Yeah. You can't fake results. So once you produce those results, people can't deny it.
Right. But people don't warn us on how difficult it is to succeed in entrepreneurship. Like, I think the number one thing you need in order to be successful in business is hunger. You have to be driven. There's this term that Rick Pitino, the Hall of Fame college basketball coach, said in a book, Success is a Choice, is a book he wrote back in the mid-90s. I love Rick's book, and it was a book that I read back then that drove me. And he talked about having the PhD attitude, passionate, hungry, and driven. And he looked to recruit basketball players for his college back in the day. This was back in the 90s for the University of Kentucky. And he looked for kids that had PhDs. And I think that's what it takes in order to be successful, is that you have to be passionate, hungry, and driven, because it gets you through tough times.
Oh, I love that. And speaking of, kind of the people who brought you to where you are today in terms of mentorship, you talk a lot about Tony Robbins. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I know that there was a few stories that you kind of told me that kind of pivoted your whole mindset on business and entrepreneurship and passion. And go ahead and take us right from there.
Well, again, I was not really encouraged to be an entrepreneur, and I was miserable in my medical sales career. And I was one of those people in the early 90s, up at 3 o'clock in the morning, kind of stressing, having anxiety about going to work the next day. And I had the infomercial. The infomercial was on, like it was on so many times back in the early 90s, of personal power and 30 days to, 30 days to freedom, or whatever it was back then.
That was a late night.
Yeah. It's Tony, Tony in his Hawaiian shirt with the palm tree swaying, and, some actors and actresses, interviewing him. But what it gave me, though, listening to Tony back then in the early 90s, was it gave me hope. And hope is ultimately what I really needed. And so I would drive around in the 5 boroughs of New York City, listening to Tony on my DVD player, driving around from hospital to hospital. And so Tony was a big influence on me very early on. But I'll tell you the big shift for me was I finally went to my first live Tony event in 1999. And what I was hoping to get out of it, this was called Unleash the Power Within. It's his signature event. It's the fire walk that people have known about for many, many years. the defining moment for me, and the reason why I went to that event, was I wanted to have the breakthrough of finally quitting my career in medical sales that I was so miserable doing for 10 years, and to go ahead and make the leap into running my business full time. And it was scary for me because in 1999, my wife and I had our daughter. We had a new home. I had the comfort and security of benefits and a company car and a salary, and to give all of that up.
The golden handcuffs.
The golden handcuffs is what I had. And believe it or not, going to UPW was life-changing for me, because what I had was a mind shift change that actually made it more risky for me not to quit the job. In other words, I thought about all the things that would happen if I didn't quit my medical sales career, all the things I was going to miss out on. I thought about how I would tell my daughter one day on how you should just live in a secure environment of safe certainty of working for somebody. And that just didn't resonate with me. And I didn't want that to be my future. And so I decided that it was time to do it and make the break. It was December of 1999. I decided I was going to leave my career, and I left it in April of 2000, and my business doubled. I made more money in 2000 than I ever did in medical sales in 10 years. Yeah.
So when you left your job, you hadn't equaled your income, right? Like you weren't making the same thing that you were making doing medical sales?
Oh my gosh, no. It was barely going to be able to make ends meet. And I think that's I've talked about this on some of the shows about not having a plan B. I'm a huge believer in not having a plan B. If I had kept that medical sales job, I believe I would have never achieved the success that I had achieved in business, because anytime the business would have got hard, I would have said, well, I have the career to fall back on. But when you burn the boats and say, I'm going to take the island and this is it, I have no choice. At that point, I had a 1-year-old at home. I had a mortgage. I had car payments. I had to make it work. I had no choice. And that's why I believe plan B is a cop-out. And I know it's not for everybody. Again, I was passionate, hungry, driven. I was willing to do whatever it took to succeed. But that's what worked for me.
You said that you kept kind of doing both, right? So you kept the softball league in New York. You started a league here in Florida. What was that like? What was that conflict like?
It was insanity. For many years, when I franchised, for many years, I didn't tell people what life was really like doing both because I didn't want to discourage them. But I was miserable at times. But as miserable as I was running an adult men's softball league, which entailed me flying to Long Island several times a year to talk with the parks and rec people, go to the schools, get my fields renewed, have in-person registration meetings. All those things were happening in New York, while here in Florida, I'm running my kids' flag football league. I'm getting referees. I'm getting fields. I'm doing all the marketing. It was it was insanity. And I didn't know how I was going to really break away from this. And the story that I didn't share with most people, I've kept private, is that at one point I actually considered selling my softball league and just saying, you know what, I'm just going to give up and be done. And I realized that was going to be the wrong answer, because the softball league was actually the thing that was succeeding and was doing well. But there was so much stress and anxiety of running a business from 1,500 miles away before the internet. Keep in mind, this is around 2000, 1999, 2000, when this all happened. It was extremely stressful.
What made you kind of decide to, okay, I need to focus on just the Florida business?
Well, that's not really what happened either. Believe it or not, the Florida business, the flag football league for kids, was probably even more stressful because I didn't have anybody helping me on either business. I had college kids that were refereeing games, often not showing up. I was running out to the field and refereeing the games. And ultimately what I decided was that there was the most potential running my adult men's softball league, which I had put all the years in, the blood, sweat, and tears of growing the business. And I realized that I was giving up the business that actually, I was going to bite the hand that was actually feeding me. But I realized that I couldn't keep doing everything. So what I ended up doing was I ended up stopped running my kids' flag football league. And I stopped that for years before I ever franchised it, before I franchised kids' sports.
Yeah.
So my claim to fame, or my real business thesis, was really based on my adult men's softball league in Long Island. It was not kids' sports. which I know as we start talking about I-9 is kids sports, but that's not really where I really made my bread and butter.
So then what was the inception of the I-9? Like, how did that kind of come about? Was that before or after you franchised?
Well, I-9 was the reason why I franchised. Like I came up with I-9 Sports as a result of deciding to franchise. Again, I knew that we were going to grow our business. I didn't know I was going to open company-owned locations or how am I going to expand this thing. I knew we were onto something, and I knew that other people were going to do it. And being first to market was like really important to me. And I didn't know how long that runway was going to be until I got national competition. So I ultimately, when I franchised the name I-9 Sports, and it was both adult men and women's softball, and it was also kids sports. And that was the birth of I-9. We were going to be everything to everybody because, quite honestly, I didn't know which one was going to succeed. Gotcha. That is the real truth.
So you always say that franchising found you. How did franchising found you as opposed to, the licensing or any other kind of, growth medium for a business? What was it about franchising that kind of drew you in and said, this is the way that we're going to expand?
Well, what drew me in was I knew, again, I didn't want to hire people. I knew I couldn't have afforded to hire people. And I knew that I wanted to be first to market. So when I started looking at the different options, whether it's opening company-owned locations, whether it's licensing, which I really think is kind of it's the cheap route of going into it. I'm a big believer in being a student of your industry, and you can never learn enough, right? It's ongoing. I'm a huge believer in personal growth and development. And so I started going to franchise conferences and I started talking to franchise consultants, and the more and more I learned about franchising, the more excited I got that this was a way of really legitimizing a business. And if you think about it, the amateur sports industry had been around for about 100 years. If you include, Little League Baseball and Pop Warner football that went back to, 1929. But as far back as the business had gone, there wasn't a whole lot of structure outside of Little League Baseball and Pop Warner. And I thought that we had a huge opportunity here that I thought, if not me, then who else, right? I had a shot at doing this.
So nobody else had franchised youth sports?
Nobody had franchised youth sports at all. And that ended up being a blessing and a curse, as I came to find out, because when I decided to franchise I-9, I was super excited about it. But as I quickly found out, as the person selling the franchises, me, I was defending the industry in that it was a legitimate business. Most people would say to me, how do you even make money doing this? And I would try to compare us, Little League Baseball and Pop Warner football and YMCA and Parks and Rec, and people just didn't get it.
So you got some pushback.
I got a lot of pushback. And I think that's one of the challenges when you're starting a sector, when you're pioneering in an industry, is that you have to convince people it's even a legitimate business. There was nothing to compare it to. That was quite a difficult time for us in 2003.
Yeah, and I've listened to you kind of say you made a lot of mistakes in the beginning. Let's talk about this shotgun approach thing.
Yes.
Because you said you were first to market, so you wanted to be everywhere all at once, and you didn't know, the repercussions of doing the shotgun approach, going, coast to coast kind of thing. Kind of walk us through your decision process there.
Well, Anthony, we did make a lot of mistakes, but I always say that the reason why we succeeded was we weren't afraid to make mistakes because we learned from them quickly, and we often did not make the same mistake twice. We learned from them. We were very, very reflective on it. I think looking back, that some of the things, if I could have done it all over again, I would do differently, would be I would not have sold ABA Sports, my softball league in New York, to fund I-9 Sports, because what it ended up doing was it created an enormous amount of stress of selling franchises to keep the lights on. So picture this. I sell the Golden Goose, right? I sell ABA.
I was paying all your bills at the time, right?
Paying all the bills. And now I got a huge chunk of money with a startup franchise with staff I could not have afforded, from the top down. So I hired a lot of people that were, big hearts. I've said this many times, big hearts that maybe weren't the right people for my company, with the exception of really one or two folks. And so it was very, very challenging that I was trying to sell franchise to keep the lights on. It's something I know I've mentioned in many episodes. Mm-hmm. I don't recommend doing, but that's what happened. And so that was one of the mistakes that we made. But I also didn't realize going in the huge benefits of franchising. Number one, I did not recognize how amazing it would be of bringing people on that I could have never afforded to have hired, and now they're franchisees. My big reason for franchising, besides being first to market, is I knew that by people being franchise owners, that they would have skin in the game and they would care, and they were probably going to do a much better job than hiring people around the country, and that proved to be true.
Yeah, when somebody has skin in the game, it changes the game completely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what in the beginning, you also talk about hiring for your weakness. You say this quite a bit. What was the first sign that you had a weakness that you needed to hire someone for?
I have a lot of weaknesses. I'm not afraid to share. I think as a founder, you know this, Anthony, as an entrepreneur, you will wear every hat and you do everything. But you also know that there's some parts of your business that you feel like you're not in flow, that you're working too hard to get a task done that shouldn't be as difficult for other people. That's when you know those are your weaknesses. Those are the things you need to hire for. So yeah, I built all the systems and processes and did all the detail work and everything, but it wasn't my wheelhouse. I was more the visionary. I was more the person. I knew where I wanted to take the business. I knew where I wanted to steer the ship. But when you're starting out, you literally do everything, right? Even down to, changing the toilet paper in the bathroom and the fax paper and everything else, right? You do whatever it takes. But I realized that what I really needed was a COO, and I couldn't afford one until about 2008. And it was the result of actually a really good conversation I had with the CEO and founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK, Brian Scudamore, who I had met at an IFA meeting years earlier. And I called Brian because he, in fact, himself had just hired a COO, and I think I read it like an Entrepreneur magazine or something. And I called Brian up and I was like, man, I'm thinking of hiring a COO. Brian, when did you know that you needed to hire a COO? And he goes, first of all, if you're thinking about it, you know that you're ready.
It's time.
It's time. And so I know that I really needed somebody to help lead the organization with me. And fortunately for me, there was a guy by the name of Brian Sanders. I know we had Brian on the show. He was
The first episode.
Season 1, episode 1. It was perfect bringing Brian on. And so Brian was a consultant who I had hired to help me with some marketing work back in 2005. And I give Brian all the credit. He crystallized the I9 Sports experience. And so I was very fortunate that Brian was available at the time. And so he was the COO and first president of the company.
Yeah, and he just retired, didn't he? Just recently?
He just retired recently, yeah. It was a magical 20-something plus years of having him part of the brand.
You said in a couple episodes that you almost went bankrupt. You were just hemorrhaging money. It was just going out the door, and not you weren't replenishing it fast enough. Was that before or after Brian?
Oh, this was before Brian.
Before Brian.
Oh yeah. So you asked me earlier about all the mistakes we made.
Yeah, that was big. That was a big one.
Well, all the mistakes we made was, again, we were selling franchises to keeping the lights on. What I didn't recognize at the time, back in 2003, 04, I didn't realize how long it was really going to take my franchisees to truly making enough money that they would not only sustain an income, but that we were going to generate enough royalties to keep the lights on. I wasn't afraid to hire staff, so I was overstaffed. But by being overstaffed and spending an enormous amount of money on franchise marketing and, overhead, it was just, we were hemorrhaging and we were losing money. I think part of the problem was that I understood what it took to build the business and the training and support that was needed. It really wasn't tight enough. But probably the biggest problem that we had is that we didn't know what I9 Sports was in 2005 because we were both adult sports and youth sports at the time. So I had adult sports franchisees that, truth be told, I could not replicate the success of what I had done in New York with my franchisees. I don't know what it is. Maybe, New York was an anomaly, but my franchisees on the adult side could not replicate that success. And that was really frustrating for me because I had some really solid people that were following what I did and they weren't getting the same uptick. At the same time, the youth sports franchisees, which I had not a lot of experience doing myself, were starting to do well. And so we had to make a huge decision to eliminate adult sports. And that would entail me being humble enough to say, I'm giving up adult sports. or you could say pivoting to where we needed to go. And I think that's another critical part of being a successful entrepreneur is when you see something to, leave all the emotional baggage out of it, leave all the past out of the way, and you cannot be afraid to pivot. And so that was another, I think, secret to our success was that we were not afraid to make that pivot. And so we ended adult sports. I didn't recognize how huge of an impact that was going to make, a positive impact, because once I9 became a youth sports brand, we knew exactly who we were. We knew exactly who our target audience was. Our marketing got so much better. Our training got better. Our support got better. I was able to hire better people. And we went from talking about hemorrhaging, we went from losing cumulatively $850,000 from 03 to 05 to I think we made $600,000 in 06. That is a huge turnaround. But we were about $50,000 or so from going out of business in 05.
Wow.
Yeah. But I look back now and I cannot believe that I was not scared to death. But back then living it, I was still confident. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But
you knew it was the right move.
I knew we were going to do it. I look back now, if you just look at the numbers on paper, you're like, are you out of your mind? Like you came that close to failing. And we came really within an eyelash of going out of business. But back then living it, I wasn't in fear and I didn't live in fear. And maybe that's the other part of to be successful as an entrepreneur is you cannot live in fear. You cannot make decisions out of fear because often you'll make the wrong decision. And I always try to make the right decision on what was right for the company, not what was popular.
Now, one of the problems with kind of pivoting that big of a pivot after you've already franchised is that some of the franchisees are already up and running, running the adult sports league. So what kind of pushback did you get from your existing franchisees at the time?
Well, we had probably about 10 adult sports franchisees. I'd say 5 or 6 of them were probably on death's doorstep.
Oh, wow.
And so
they were feeling it.
They have already been feeling it. It was no surprise. Gotcha. So there was about half of them where I said, hey, look, we have youth sports available in your market, that they did convert to youth sports. The other half continue to run adult sports. And so I let them out of their franchise agreement, basically said, hey, if you want to keep doing adult sports, I'll just let you out of the franchise agreement. We came to a mutual termination. I let them out, and then they continue to run adult sports. In fact, there were some guys in New York and New Jersey, no surprise, right, that they continue to run adult sports. And I think they still run it today, and they run it well.
That's crazy how the markets are so different.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people from New York, and they do play softball, they play baseball as an adult,
Right.
Whereas here in Florida, you don't see that much. I mean, there's still adult leagues, but not as prevalent as New York.
There are adult leagues, but the problem is that you can't command the kind of cost per team down here in Florida and in many markets, as I came to find out of what you could do up in the Northeast.
Now, one of the like growing pains that I kind of heard you tell one of your guests is the NFL story. I know you kind of when you first started the youth sports, they had the NFL licensing. I think it was where you guys kind of partnered with them, but then that kind of fell apart. Kind of take us through that.
This was a really scary moment. So this was, at this point in time, we had turned around the business, right? We were profitable. This is 2006.
You're doing great.
Things are going pretty well. You always have to be careful. Anytime things are going really well in business, you know that the roller coaster ride is about to change, right? And that's exactly what happened. So one day, just at clear blue sky in January of 06, I get an email from the NFL that said that starting within, I think it was within like that season, if you run an NFL flag league, you can no longer have an independent website, that all of the registrations had to come through the NFL's third party that they had partnered with called active.com. The big decision for me was all of our franchisees, by the way, preceding that time, were all running their leagues, by the way, as NFL flag. We did not run as I9 Sports Flag Football.
Really?
We ran as NFL flag football up until that point. And the reason why we thought that having the NFL name was the reason why we were successful.
Yeah, that brand recognition, the NFL is the most recognized brand in the world.
Yeah, and so we thought the NFL name actually meant something. So I came to an inflection point where I had to make a decision over a course of a weekend where we were either A, going to funnel all of our registrations outside of our closed loop, outside of our software, and register all of our franchisees' customers through this third-party NFL website, or was I going to abandon the NFL name and start running our leagues as I9 Sports, a name that we quite honestly weren't sure that people were going to be excited about joining? The idea of giving up our data, of selling our data, to me was far, far more painful and really risky because, let's face it, at some point the NFL could have been like, thanks for the data, we're going on our own, and we could have lost everything. I thought there was nothing more valuable than our data back then. And
they could have just completely taken you out of the equation completely.
Yeah, they could have easily done that. And so I talked to a lot of the franchisees. Of course, our franchisees were scared to death because they thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to run my leagues as I9 like nobody knows me as I9. But here's my belief at the time. We had been running our league now for 3 years, right? 2003. We were going into our 4th season. And from the survey and from the surveys I was getting back from parents and from the feedback we were getting, I really believe that the reason why people were joining our leagues was because of the I9 experience. It wasn't because of the NFL name. And so we made the difficult decision over a course of a weekend to go with I9 Sports as our league name. And that's how we were going to market. And truthfully, I did kind of hold my breath because I didn't know how it was going to turn out. And the results were the franchisees who had just left training, who had never marketed as NFL flag football, got double the amount of registrations any franchisee had ever gotten before as NFL. It turns out that the NFL name didn't mean a damn thing.
Oh, yeah.
It meant nothing.
It was the experience.
It was the experience, and it was the marketing plan.
What was it about the experience? What made I9 such a great, youth sports league?
I think we knew exactly who we were catering to. We knew we weren't going to be a league that was highly competitive, cutthroat. It wasn't about it wasn't going to be a cutthroat league. I knew the fundamentals are we were about fun, we were about safety, and we were about convenience. Practices and games on the same day. Really think about who's our customer. Our target audience, as it turns out, was mom. And we learned that very quickly after doing our survey in the first several years that 75 to 80% of our registrations came from mom. And so once we knew we were really in the mom business, we knew we were in the convenience business. Thus, practices and games on the same day, no fundraisers, no tryouts, no drafts, everybody plays. We weren't about just winning. We were also going to reward kids for good sportsmanship. And we believed that winning meant something, but it wasn't a win-at-all-costs attitude. And so once, all that just kind of rolled off my tongue, we knew exactly who we were about once we knew who our customer was. And that's why our company took off, I think.
That actually brings me to, what is I9? What does it stand for? Where did that name come from?
Okay, again, the real truth of the matter is that we didn't know what our name was going to be when we were going to franchise. So if you think about it, I had ABA Sports back in New York. It stood for Amateur Ball Players Association. Terrible name.
Great name.
It certainly wasn't going to be a name I was going to hang my hat on to franchise. So the difficulty was coming up with a name that was going to satisfy both adult sports and youth sports, but it had to be a name that I felt was going to be unique, because as I learned more and more about franchising, I realized that trademarking, of course, the name is important, but not just trademarking, it's protecting your trademark, because in many cases, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, they'll approve a name, but it's a name that's similar to a lot of other names. So I'll give you an example, like Grand Slam Sports. Terrible name. We probably could have got that approved. But try to defend Grand Slam Sports when somebody else, trademarks, or somebody else runs a league that's called Grand Slam. So I knew that we needed something that was going to be very unique. The downside to having a unique name, though, is that it costs probably 10 times the amount of marketing to getting that brand awareness out there. But just think about the power of a strong trademark, a Kleenex, a Xerox, a Pepsi, or Coca-Cola. Like, it costs so much money to get that name out there. But once that name is known, to this day, people often come up to me and say, my kid plays I9. They don't say my kid plays flag football. They say my kid plays I9, and it's the coolest thing. But anyway, the name came from the 9 I's. One night, late at night, I started writing down all these words that I thought that were symbolic for our company. And so all these I words kind of jumped off the page to me. Words like innovative, integrity, impassioned, insightful, instructive. Don't quote me on all the on the 9 I's, but basically I had all these I words written down, and I thought I to the 9th power looks so cool. And I came into work the next morning and I told my staff, I think I got the name I9 Sports, and they were like, huh? But of course, as we franchised it, everybody came to love the name. And I worked with the designer to create the logo. And I thought that the red, white, blue, and silver meant a lot to me. The red in our logo was the passion. Blue, that navy blue, or as I like to say, Yankee blue. I'm a New York Yankee diehard fan. I believe that navy blue represents integrity. And that silver elliptical part of the logo, to me, is it meant technology. It meant like cutting edge and leading. And that's the genesis, the reason why those colors are what they are.
Yeah, and those are your core values, right? The core values of the company, the core values of the franchise. And I got to admit, full transparency, my son actually played I9. And one of the reasons why we joined I9 is because, we had tried, youth sports before, and it's just either unorganized or the parents are just unbearable, and there was just too many Chiefs, not enough Indians,
Sure.
kind of situation. How did you guys kind of separate yourselves from those poorly run, leagues?
Well, again, the truth is that our industry is mostly made up of unorganized leagues that are often nonprofit, made up of volunteers. And I knew that the bar or the hurdle that we had to clear was pretty low, right? So going back to my adult softball league, I was competing mostly with privately run leagues who were also poorly run, but I was also competing with parks and rec leagues. And so I knew that ultimately, what do people want? They want good communication. They want some structure. They want a league to be organized. They want a schedule ahead of time. Like, it really wasn't a whole lot that we had to do to surpass the experiences or the expectations for people. Probably the key difference for me, Anthony, was I didn't look at the other leagues as my competition.
Ooh, I like that.
What I did was I looked at other industries as my competition. I thought we were really in the entertainment business. And when you think on a much grander picture, or you think of industry experience or customer satisfaction, start comparing yourself to, you want to be better than, or you want to have that raving fan base of a Costco, of an Apple, of an Amazon. When you start thinking about those companies, and that's how you want your customers to perceive you in that arena versus just competing with the local soccer league, you're playing in another stratosphere. And that's how I kind of thought about our company right from the get-go, is I wanted to have that kind of raving fan base.
Yeah, it's about the customer experience at the end of the day. And like you said, it's about the moms. It's not about the kids.
If mom's happy, everybody's happy.
Everybody's happy. Yes, sir. All right, so I9's up and running. You're profitable. You're just cruising. What are your key takeaways of running I9?
Up until then?
Yeah.
It's a whole lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
And a lot more expensive.
A lot more expensive. Probably one of my, misperceptions was I thought that all franchisees were going to have the same drive that I had. I didn't realize that people were going to come from all different walks of life, that were going to have different levels of what they thought was success for them. And that sometimes people buy a business and they think once you buy a franchise that it's like, when they think it's turnkey, they think it's just making money right away. And so that was a big miss. But I realized as we went along, I started to figure out who the right franchisee was for us by using some assessment tools like a predictive index. But more so, I really started to hone in more on the culture, on bringing on the right franchisees and bringing on the right employees. And things were humming along and things were going really well. We then got to the point of the recession, which we really blew through the recession fairly well. As you can imagine, moms and dads are not going to tell their kid that they can't play soccer or can't do music lessons or get tutoring. We got through the recession fairly well and unscathed from a franchisee perspective. I had a hell of a time, though, trying to sell franchises during the recession. And that was part of our own doing, because we had a lot of people that came to us that wanted to buy a franchise that we weren't willing to sell a franchise to during the recession, because their hope was they had like $50,000 to their name and they never wanted to work for the man again. They wanted to own a business during the recession. And I knew that they were going to fail, that they wouldn't be able to keep their doors open, because it takes a while to be successful in business. And they couldn't answer the question to my satisfaction. And that was, how are you going to survive for the first 18 to 24 months without making much money? And if they couldn't answer that question well, I didn't award them a franchise. So it was sort of self-inflicted back in during the recession that we had difficulty selling franchises. And I think that's probably a very important point to make now. Here we are in 2024, and there's a looming recession. We know it's going to happen at some point. And I hope somebody that's watching or listening to this, if they're running a mediocre franchise operation, but is selling franchises, I got news for you. Your days of selling franchise to quality people is going to come to an end unless you get your act together. So get that critical mass of making your franchisee successful now before the economy turns, so that you survive it.
Yeah, and I've heard you say also that don't depend on selling franchises to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
That's a bad strategy, because when a recession or pandemic or whatever it is, whatever comes along, it's gonna halt your business at some point. So you need something to keep the lights on when you can't sell franchises.
Totally. I got lucky. I think maybe life is a little bit fate, or a lot of bit fate and a little bit of luck. And I think where the luck came in is I started in 2003. And the luck was I got a lot longer runway. I know you're going to ask me what's probably your biggest surprise, because we always ask that question every podcast.
That was going to be my next one.
Fine. My biggest surprise is that I didn't think I was going to get as much runway as I ended up getting before competition started, national competition started. That was my big surprise, because I was always looking over my shoulder to think I was going to have a national competitor. I got about 5-6 years in. And where the luck came in is I got about 5 years in, and when the recession started, we didn't get any franchise or competition. Who's going to start franchising their company during the recession? Nobody did, right? If anything, the mediocre franchisors went out of business. So I got that. That was quite a bit of luck that I got. And I think, though, in order to succeed, obviously, in franchising, franchisees have to be profitable. You have to focus on unit economics. All the things we've talked about for the last 100 episodes applies very much to I9 Sports. But we always try to put our franchisees first and make the best decision for our franchisees. And often that meant making decisions where we were going to have to delay our gratification as a franchisor to making sure that our franchisees were successful. And there was many times we did just that.
Let's fast forward a little bit to, you're running I9. What was, a lot of franchisors don't really think of exit strategy, which you've kind of said, you kind of need to think about that from the beginning. Mm-hmm. What was the point in running the I9 that you said, I think it's time to start thinking about that?
I thought I was going to run I9 Sports for life.
All entrepreneurs do, honestly.
Right? It was my dream to start this. First of all, when I was running my softball league, I could not believe I was getting paid to run an adult men's softball league. Like, that was my dream. And then when I9 got started, I was like, I cannot believe I franchised a concept. I'm making money doing this, making a difference in the lives of franchisees and kids. And I was like, you're never getting me out of here. I'm going to do this forever. But then something very interesting happened, and that was this. I learned as I continue to build a team, and I was very, very fortunate, is that I had a phenomenal management team around me. They replaced everything that I would normally do. Yes, I would come in as the CEO and founder, and I was involved in all the strategic meetings, and I would sit in on the one-on-one meetings and stuff. But I found myself in a point where I was no longer fulfilled, because I think my dream was achieved already. And so at this point, I'm in my late 40s, and I turned to my wife, I turned to Nadine and said, I think we should probably be smart here and maybe take some chips off the table, because anything can happen. Our net worth was completely tied up in I9 Sports. If you had seen my 401k or my IRA back then, it was dismal. I mean, we were, we just plowed all of our money back into the company. And so I thought it was probably a wise choice to take the emotion out of the business and be smart about this and maybe take some chips off. And of course, once again, Tony Robbins comes into the equation here. I went to Business Mastery in 2015. And I really went to kind of get my mojo back because, again, I was no longer fulfilled. My dream was achieved. And Tony, I know I think I've mentioned this on a few shows, but Tony said at this Business Mastery, where I'm trying to get remotivated, Tony says, success without fulfillment is ultimate failure. And I thought he was speaking to me. And right after that, he said, if you are no longer passionate for what you do, you owe it to yourself and you owe it to your company to get out. Now, I had been following Tony for what at this point? Maybe 25 years. I had never heard Tony Robbins ever say quit anything, but here he was saying, here's a good reason why you need to move on. Now, this is Business Mastery. Most people that were sitting around me were, they're taking notes, and that very line that he said probably went in one ear and out the other ear of most people. For the majority of people,
yeah.
Yeah. But for me, it felt like he was speaking to me because he was talking to me at that point in time. And I think that's the thing about going to personal development seminars. And why do you keep going to them? Because you hear something different that maybe didn't resonate with you at some point in your life, and it changes. And so I made that difficult decision, realizing that I love I-9 Sports so much. It wasn't that I wasn't passionate about the company. I love the company, but I was no longer fulfilled and that my dream was achieved. And I was feeling like the vision had been fulfilled and it was time to move on. And so I went really through this process. It took about 1.5 years before I ultimately decided to move forward with that. And it actually took a conversation with my life coach that ultimately made me decide that.
What was it about that time in your life that you decided to do that?
I think what it was is that when I'd go to the office, I was no longer needed. And I think it hurt. Nadine would tell me, I don't care what you do when you go to the office. Go there because the energy in the office, as she was told, and I was told, was different when I was there. And I was passionate. I loved seeing the people, and I was close to my staff. And Nadine would say, just go to the office. And I don't care what you do, but just go. It's just different when you just be there.
Your existence.
But that's not why I started the company. I started because I loved what I did. And I loved being hands-on. I loved being in the IT bullpen and talking about the software development and being in a marketing meeting and talking strategy and having my, rolling up my sleeves and actually being involved. But I accomplished what many entrepreneurs set out to do. You build a team to do everything, and there was nothing for me to do on a day-to-day basis. And the idea of playing golf or playing softball every day and going on vacation and traveling, which we did a lot of traveling, thanks to Brian running the company day to day. So I didn't have to be there every day. And not that I wanted to be there every single day, but to be kind of half in, half out, that wasn't me. That's like hurting my baby. And I thought that maybe the company would be better off if I left, because it would no longer make me as the centerpiece of the company, and that the company would really take it to another level with the next generation of a team. As it turns out, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And I've heard there's a lot of parallels between raising a child and building a company because it is your baby, you're just so passionate about it.
Yeah.
What was it like kind of handing off your baby to someone else?
I was not scared in the least bit.
Really?
I had all the faith. I kid you not, if there was one thing that I knew for sure, and that was the baby was well taken care of. Folks and there's too many names. I know I won't be able to name everybody on the show right now, but people like Brian and Kim and Susan and at the time, April and Scott in marketing and in operations. And I just had such a solid team. And the customer service folks with Jeff and Jen, it was just, the baby was taken care of. I had nothing to be concerned about.
You had peace of mind.
I had peace of mind, but I was no longer needed. And so I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew that when it was time to move on, obviously I had to sit down and have the conversation with Brian. And Brian was, I'm so fortunate that I got a chance to hire a COO and president who really was a mentor to me. I mean, how rare is it to get a chance to hire your mentor?
Right.
But Brian's somebody who I always looked up to. And to this day, I always say, one day when I grow up, I want to be like Brian. And I feel that way to this day. And when I told Brian that I was thinking it was time for me to move on, the first thing he asked me was, he was most concerned about me and my well-being and where was my head at. And he said to me, Frank, I don't mind you leaving. I just want to make sure you're not running away from something and you're running to something. And he said that because he truly cared about me as a person. That's the kind of relationship that Brian and I have always had. And, I've had with the other folks in the office. It's just, it was at a different, we played at a different frequency.
You really did.
Yeah. I'm very, very fortunate.
As far as exit strategy, there's a lot of ways to do it. PE, just selling the company to someone or like you did, ESOP. Like what was it about the ESOP?
Well, it was at that Tony Robbins actually event when Tony said, success without fulfillment is ultimate failure, that he talked about, he did an ESOP with his company and the advantages of doing an ESOP. Number one is by doing an ESOP, you are giving the shares or selling the company to the employees. They don't have to have any money to put into the company. The company gets funded, and then it pays the founder or pays the owner, and then shares go to the employees. And I thought, oh my gosh, I get to reward the people that helped me build the company by selling the company to them. We take there's no competitive discussions of potentially giving away our trade secrets to competition and selling it to them, or the deal falling through and them, competing with us even further. The tax implications of selling directly to PE was going to be vast. And here, when you do an ESOP, all your taxes deferred. So there was a lot of great advantages to selling as an ESOP. I look back over the 20 years, and one of the greatest days was the day that I told the employees that I sold the company to them. But when I sat down with each person and told them what it actually meant to them in real dollars,
yeah,
was one of the greatest days of my career.
Wow, what was that like? I know it was pretty emotional for you.
Well, going in that morning, my wife and I, we were excited to go into the office and can't wait to share with our staff on, what it really means to them. And this was the result of when we had already ESOPed, and now we were selling the company. So their shares were going to become whole now. They were going to become fully vested, and it was going to be real dollars for them. And so sitting down, we brought employees one at a time, and it was me and Nadine and Brian and Kim, and the four of us brought employees one at a time and share with them what it meant. And there was tears flowing that day. When you're telling people,
it's life-changing.
6 figures, in some cases 7 figures. I mean,
wow,
it was life-changing for all of us.
For everyone, yeah.
And you don't know what people are going through in their personal lives all the time. And you don't know sometimes the pressures and struggles and stresses that they leave at home and didn't bring to the office. But there was some really, really honest discussion on what that meant and how that was going to change their life. And it was, I think about it now, I get emotional about it. I kid you not. It was the most touching moment for me in business ever. And we went through a couple of boxes of tissues that day. Let's put it that way in the conference room. But it was an amazing, amazing feeling. And I'm blessed and grateful that it wasn't me that did this. These people all earned it. They did it. The difference was, though, we found a vehicle where we could all get rewarded for our efforts. And so it was a great time. And it was also bittersweet because it also meant the exit, my exit in the company. But it was the right time. I knew it was the right time for me.
Yeah, and just like losing a loved one, you kind of mentioned in a few episodes that you went through a grieving process. Mm-hmm. What was that like? I
was happy when I sold the company for about a week, because you see the money in the bank account, you get all excited.
And the reality sets in.
And then reality sets in that you have nowhere to go and you really have no purpose. Now, going back to what Brian said, I want to make sure you're not running away from something, running to something. He and I have talked about that since then. And I wasn't running away from the company. What I was running towards really finding myself again, a new identity, which I had not had at the time. And so I had already been through that identity crisis where me and I-9 were one. I had already separated myself for years. So that was already gone. But the grieving process was real in any death. And I went through the shock. I went through the denial. I often woke up in the middle of the night with, I cannot believe did I really do this? Did I really sell the company?
Wow. Did you have any second thoughts?
At first, I had second thoughts in wondering I think it was more because I didn't know what I was going to do next, because I didn't know what life had in store for me.
Yeah, it's the unknown.
It was the unknown. But I knew when I really thought about it, it was still the right decision. It's so weird to know that you need to get rid of something, but you don't know where you're going to go to next, but it still feels right. Back then, I said those were the dark days for me. But I look back now and realize that it was those years of pondering and contemplating and recovery that turns out, Anthony, I was burned out. And I didn't know at the time, but I was burnt to a crisp. I probably worked, I probably put 35 years of work in 20 years. Wow. I worked a lot of hours.
And money too. I mean, you kept putting money back into the business. So your business was your life. It
was my life. And fortunately, my wife, though, kept me very, very balanced. I was home every night for dinner. I spent time with the kids. We have lots of great memories of playing, playtime at night, and also did lots of traveling because my wife homeschooled the kids after Brian came aboard. So I did get a chance to get away. But what I found myself doing, and maybe there's other entrepreneurs that are hearing this, is I found myself going on vacation. Often we would travel we visit like all the Major League Baseball stadiums and all the national parks and, museums, you name it. We did everything. But I found myself when I went back to the office, I was not recharged. And that bothered me because you're supposed to go on vacation and come back re-energized, and I was not re-energized. And the more I went away, and I'd come back, the more I realized that fuse was getting shorter and shorter. And I knew that a change had to be made. So I knew it was the right decision, even though I look back and say, man, there was some dark days after I exited the company. Those days were a process that I just had to go through. I was burned out. I had adrenal fatigue syndrome back then too, that I had been diagnosed with, going to a functional medicine doctor. And it was a rough 2016, 2017, 2018, part of 2018. Those were some rough 3 years.
Okay. So you closed the book on I-9, you kind of move on from that. Your baby goes on and does amazing things without you. What was that like? The not having the purpose, and because you didn't know that you were going to start the podcast yet, right?
Oh, heck no. Podcast, the last thing from my mind. I didn't know what I was going to do. I started doing a little bit of coaching of folks, and it just wasn't really.
You said, you kind of mentioned also that you got back into softball too, because that was like the genesis of everything. So you thought that by doing that, it was going to bring back your passion, your purpose.
So baseball always somehow has been involved in my life, has been a huge impact on my life. And I had heard of this adult men's softball league in St. Pete. That's an over 50 league. And they play 3 times a week. They've been around for 90 years.
Wow.
And so one morning I drove to the park in St. Pete, and my intentions weren't even to play because I had not played in years. My intentions were just to go see them play. And
you got pulled in.
I pull into the parking lot. No joke. If these guys are watching or hearing this episode, my apologies. But the very first thing is I pull my car into the parking lot. I see a fly ball hit out into the outfield, and I see the guy, like the ball literally bounced in and out of his mitt. And I went, well, I can do that. So suddenly I wasn't intimidated. Nice. And so I started playing softball that day. They invited me onto the field, and I felt alive. And I felt like a kid again. And for whatever reason, I don't know what it is, but there's something about the game of baseball. When I'm on the field, it's oxygen for my soul. And so I started.
Safe place.
It is my safe place, but I feel like it's like a getaway. It is. It feels like home. Baseball feels like home to me. And so once I started playing softball again, and I was playing it 3 times a week, I was driving on the interstate in a softball uniform at Monday morning at 8:30 in the morning while people are driving to work. I'm in a softball uniform trying to get to a game, and it was wild. I mean, the guys would say to me, it's, hey, Frank, good morning. How's it going? I'm like, how's it going? I'm playing softball on a Monday morning. How do you think it's going? This is amazing. But here's what happened. I realized that as much fun as it was, there was no purpose. It was fun. It reignited something in me, but I knew it wasn't something I was going to do for life. That I wasn't going to play softball every day. Just like playing softball with my college buddies back in the early 90s, it ignited something is what it did.
And then did that kind of die out, or are you still doing that?
Well, what happened was I tore my quad muscle legging out a triple that I probably
as used to be, man.
Yeah, I was running as if someone was like chasing me with a knife, and you shouldn't do that when you're 50 plus years old. But I was legging out a triple. I tore my quad muscle. It took me five months of rehab, and I ended up going to San Diego to a business conference. again, trying to like spark something again, entrepreneurship wise. It was a consulting for equity conference I went to. And I started telling the guys we had to do like an introduction in this group. And so I stood up and I introduced myself and my background. And I had a couple guys come up to me and say, dude, you got to do a podcast.
And you're like, what's that?
I'm like, I didn't listen to podcasts at all. Like I listen to Joe Rogan every once in a while. I like Joe Rogan's show, but I didn't listen to podcasts much. So these two guys, separate incidences during this conference, they didn't even know each other, but on two separate occurrences during this conference, these guys said to me that I need to start a podcast. And I was thinking, okay, I don't know anything about how to start one. I have no idea what to do, but I thought about what I was most passionate about. And the time of my life that was most exciting was the early days of I-9 when we were emerging. And so that's where the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast came to be.
And that's where the name came from, the Emerging Franchise Brands.
It was a very easy name to come up because I thought about, I want to be the mentor that I didn't have. And I thought about all the things that I didn't have in 2003, 2004, 2005, when we were almost going out of business. And I thought, if I'm going to have a voice again in franchising, and I really, truth was, I was out of franchising for years, right? Since leaving I-9. What would be that time period? What would be the angle that I would want to kind of be able to fill that gap and fill that hole? And I thought there's really not enough people doing work in helping emerging franchise founders, specifically founders. And when I heard there's two statistics that have always bothered me and we've talked about on the show many times. The first stat is that 84% of all franchisors never get to 100 units. We did it in 4 years at I-9 Sports. And then the second statistic that always bothered me was that there's still 4,000 franchisors in the industry. There were 4,000 franchisors in franchising in 2003. And as it turns out, the statistic is that there's about 300 to 400 new franchisors every year franchising, and about 300 to 400 franchisors rolling out of franchising. And that to me is unacceptable. I think the reason why so many of those franchisors roll out of franchising is a lot of reasons. Of course, they're not executing. They haven't made a full commitment to franchising. They don't realize they're in the franchise business. But we could do a whole episode on just that. Yeah. But that's what really sparked the decision to have a podcast directed at founders of emerging brands.
Yeah, and there's something to be said because we kind of started with mentorship and now we're ending with mentorship. That's the common theme, right? So if you're going into franchising, I've heard a lot of your guests say that, their tip is to find a mentor. And I'm glad that you decided to be that for someone that's going through, the struggles and things that you kind of went through. I think it was Brooke that you interviewed that said, I want to be the mentor that Brooke needed, or that Brooke,
precisely
needed back in the day.
Yes.
So I want to be that for her, or for people like her. So yeah. I'm glad that you kind of went through this route, and you're being a mentor to thousands of people.
I have not had this much fun doing something in probably 15 years. I love this podcast. I love working with you. I love working with Savannah. We have our little team. We're small, but a mighty team. I love interviewing founders of all different walks of life, interviewing franchise industry experts, getting their different angles. We're not afraid to have some difficult or challenging conversations about some of the most, hotly debated topics like private equity. But I love that I get a chance to talk with people all different walks of life. And probably my biggest takeaway that I've gotten from this podcast in 100 episodes is how passionate these founders are about their brand. And it's just so refreshing. I see so much of myself from 2003 in these people where, they're bright-eyed, they're ready to go, they're willing to do whatever it takes for their brand. And also I could tell you from being on that side of the mic and interviewing a lot of those people, I know which ones are going to make it and which ones are probably not going to make it based on, I don't know, there's this, I just have a sixth sense about
like intuition.
Yeah, it's an intuition that you just know that they're really going to do what it takes to succeed in franchising. But I'm just so impressed by how many really, really solid founders there are. And I'm excited to watch them on their journey and succeed and have their own have their own story that hopefully will end with an incredible exit.
No, absolutely. And here we are, 100 episodes in. We're still going strong, you know, almost 4,000 subscribers out there. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm not going to let you off the hook, man. we always finish each episode with the tip jar, and you know, you've given us an amazing podcast full of tips. But if you had one thing that stands above all the rest, what is your tip for the tip jar?
And people have mentioned this before on our show. I still think that the secret to success, besides obviously being hungry, is you never stop learning to be truly a student of your industry. And, you know, we've talked about many times about joining the IFA. There's one thing to like join the IFA, the International Franchise Association, but it's another thing to really be active in it and going to the conferences and talking to other founders. In other words, success has left many, many clues before. You don't have to go into franchising doing this on your own. Somebody has already done it, and talk to other people in franchising. The community is so generous, as we talk about, and I lead into the tip jar always that way. But I truthfully, I mean that with all sincerity. It's like, talk to many, many people in franchising before you franchise. Talk to other founders, find out what they're doing. Talk to people who've already done what you're trying to do in your very industry. You'll be amazed on how generous they will be in sharing their information.
And thank you for being so generous, Frank. I'm honored to be part of this journey with you. And, you know, here's to another 100 episodes.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I appreciate being on the show, Anthony.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fiume, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.